Hello, everyone. This is our continuation of the Portuguese-American Oral History Project from the California State University, Fresno, through the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute, PBBI, from Fresno State, in a collaboration and sponsored by the Luso-American Development Foundation of FLAD. All of our oral histories are recorded and they are archived through the Fresno State Library System in the special collections. And so we have our guest for today. What is your full birth name, in the entire name, first and last?
So my full birth name is Carol Ann Gregory.
Wonderful. And Carol, were you named after anyone, and is there any kind of story behind your name?
The only story behind my name is, so my mom's name was Mary Ann. So, she wanted to continue the Ann theme, the middle name. So she named me Carol Ann. My sister's name is Lisa Ann. And then my other sister's name is Deborah Ann. So I was the firstborn. So they called me Carol Ann. So that's the story behind that. And my mom she was full Portuguese. So
when and where were you born?
So I was born in Alameda, California. My birthday's coming up February 16th, 1975.
And what early memories, Carol, do you have as a child? Some of your earliest memories in a Portuguese-American community, or your mom is the one that's Portuguese, as you said, or was there not much relation with the Portuguese-American community? Tell us a little bit about your childhood.
Yeah, so unfortunately, as a child, I didn't have much relations with the Portuguese community. Again, my mom was full Portuguese. My dad was not Portuguese, so I'm only half Portuguese. I guess the only relations that I did have growing up with the Portuguese culture and Portuguese heritage is my grandmother on my mom's side. She was living during the time, and she lived in Pleasanton, California. And she immigrated to the United States very young from Fayal in the Azores. She wasn't really connected to the culture too much by the time I was growing up. She was very much into, she was Catholic. She was very much into the Catholicism, Catholic religion. And in her home, she would have a lot of statues, particularly of St. Jude. She prayed to the rosary. She did make Portuguese food at times. She would make Portuguese sweetbread and Portuguese beans. So, and we stayed at her house many times, and we always would visit her. So I guess that was my closest connection maybe to the Portuguese. My Portuguese heritage was because of my grandmother and seeing her. Growing up, I actually did live in San Jose for a few years. I went to middle school there. And my mom was also going to college during that time at San Jose State University, I believe. And there's still a large Portuguese community in San Jose. So I remember, I think this was about when I was 10 or 11 or 12. She had to do a report on her Portuguese heritage. And knowing that there was a large Portuguese community in San Jose, I remember going to Little Portugal. We went to like a travel agency there, got information on the Azores. And she did more some history of her background, her Portuguese background. And I remember seeing Five Wounds Church and so forth. That was like my only first time, my first time going to Little Portugal in San Jose and remembering that growing up. So during that time, we did go to the Portuguese community, and we did, see Little Portugal for her research for school. But I never went to any festas or any Portuguese community events or anything like that. Again, because my mom, she didn't really grow up in the Portuguese community either, or was around Portuguese organizations. So yeah, I just wasn't exposed to the culture, the heritage, and the community when I was younger, unfortunately.
And so a little bit about your family history, as you just gave us quite a bit of it. But so who immigrated in your family? And you said they came from Fayal. Who immigrated? I believe you said your grandmother. So when did she come over, and do you know any of that, of the reasons basically, where in many cases were economics, but other reasons as well, why she came over and where she settled?
Yeah, so again, my grandmother, who lived in Pleasanton a majority of her life, she was born in Faytera, Fayal. Sorry if I'm not pronouncing that correctly. She was born in the Azores. She was when she was only a year and a half years old. Her parents immigrated to the United States, to California, and this was in May of 1912. So it was quite a long time ago.
So she was almost like born here, basically. I mean, she just didn't have any memories of the Azores, obviously.
Pretty much, yes, pretty much. And interesting story behind her family. So my great grandfather, he was the youngest of 12, or I'm sorry, the youngest of 11 siblings. He had already had older siblings that had immigrated to the United States, to California, probably in the 1890s in particular, because he was sponsored by his oldest sibling to come to the United States. So they came on the ship Madonna. I think doing my genealogy research, I don't remember the exact dates, but I know they left Horta in April of 1912, and then they came over by ship, and they came in May of 1912. So my great grandfather's siblings, he had like 3, 4, or 5 siblings that were already in California. Again, one of them, the oldest sibling, Manuel, sponsored him. They went to Hollister, California. There was a small Portuguese community already settled in Hollister, and many of my great grandfather's siblings were already in the Hollister area. So he was sponsored by his older sibling and came over to Hollister, and he worked as an orchardist in the Hollister area. The San Benito County was known for apricots and orchard growing, so he was in the orchard industry.
Did your grandmother ever mention any stories that she might have gotten from her parents, who were actually, although she was an immigrant, but at the age of 1.5, practically born in the United States? Did she ever mention any stories about her grandparents, who would be, of course, your great grandparents, and how those times were? Do you have any stories that were passed down at all?
Unfortunately, I don't, and that's one thing I do regret to this day. My grandmother was a member of the SPRSI organization for many years, and when she passed, we got like a small little death benefit from that. But I regret to this day that I never really asked her much about her Portuguese heritage and culture and her parents and growing up in the Hollister community. I know when my mom did some research for her school project, she had old photos that my grandma had of growing up in Hollister. There's some old photos we have where my grandma was never a queen for the Hollister Festa. I know she did go to the Festa in Hollister, and she went to a Catholic school, a Sacred Heart Catholic school. And so that we have like old pictures of my grandmother in Catholic school. And then we have I had pictures of her like wearing a white dress. I think she might have been a side maid, possibly at the Festa, or part of the Festa parade. So I know she went to the Festa, and she actually met her husband, Manuel Santana, in the Hollister area as well. And I have that's another side of my family heritage. He had, his parents were born in the Azores. He was born in the United States, but so yeah, unfortunately, I do regret this. I could have asked my grandmother about it, but she wasn't forthcoming in talking about growing up, in the Portuguese community in the Hollister area. She became a U.S. citizen, I know, at age 21. So, and I know she spoke Portuguese for many years to her, because let's see here, her mother lived until 1939. Her father, unfortunately, passed away when he was very young. Like when she was only 17 or 16, he passed away. So I think she had a tough childhood too. She had a younger brother who was born in the U.S. I think she had a tough childhood, and her parents passed away when they were young, and so I think it might have been hard to talk about that as well. So.
And so, for all kind of technical purposes, since she came over at the age of 1.5, you're basically fourth generation, if we look at because she technically was born there but raised here, and cultural anthropologists look at that as like a 1.5 type of a deal, or actually as they already a firstborn here because all of their education, everything was here. So you're fourth generation. So how did you connect? Because I know that eventually, and we'll talk about your PhD that involves the Portuguese American experience in California. So how did you eventually connect to this heritage that, you had bits and pieces of it, but not a full upbringing with it?
True. So I connected it also through doing school research and doing school projects. Again, I always knew I was half Portuguese. I was always interested in the culture and in the heritage, but I never really pursued it until I was a graduate student at UC Davis. I was in like an economic history class, and we had to do a project on studying the history of a community. And at the time, so I'd moved, my family and I moved from the Sacramento area in the early 90s. So I was living in the Sacramento area at the time, and we lived in a community called Sacramento's Greenhaven Pocket area. And actually, going back a little bit too, when we first moved to Sacramento, and we went to Old Sacramento, I do remember this also. They were having a big Portuguese event in Old Sacramento that the Portuguese Historical and Culture Society, which I'm involved with, put on. And my family and I went to that event, and they had a chamarita dancing there. And that was my first time that I saw a chamarita dancing. And we went to the museum. They had a big exhibit on Portuguese history in the Sacramento area. And at the time, I didn't know much about the Portuguese community in the Sacramento area or know any of the people. But my family and I went to this event. So this was when I was in high school. So I was kind of exposed to that as well. But then, and so we always knew about too, this book that the Portuguese Historical and Culture Society wrote called The Portuguese Pioneers of the Sacramento Area. So I remember all that. And so when I was in college at UC Davis and living in the Pocket area, I knew about the large Portuguese community that was in that area at one time. And I would just be fascinated with studying the history of the Greenhaven Pocket area and the Portuguese families that settled there. So I decided to do a research project on Sacramento's Greenhaven Pocket area and the Portuguese families that settled there. And also, I was very intrigued by the fact that the Portuguese Historical and Culture Society, how they formed because of all the development going on in the Pocket area in the 70s and 80s. They were very concerned about Portuguese history being lost in that area. And I work for the County of Sacramento. I've been a government employee for many years, interested in urban planning and land use development. I was always intrigued by the fact that this Portuguese organization, this nonprofit organization, they wanted to preserve the Portuguese heritage and culture of the Pocket area. And they worked with the city of Sacramento and the developers to make sure that, at least some memory of the Portuguese community was kept during the development. So Portuguese Community Park in the Pocket area is there to commemorate the Portuguese history. I was always fascinated by that aspect. Many street names in the Pocket area have Portuguese names to reflect the Portuguese history and heritage of the area. They have an elementary school. It's now changed names, unfortunately, but one time it was called Lisbon Elementary School, and that was in honor of the Portuguese schools that were established at the time when there was heavy presence in the Pocket area. There was schools called Lisbon schools that were established. So this elementary school that was created or built in the late 80s was named after those schools, the Lisbon Elementary School. So just studying about the Greenhaven Pocket area and the Portuguese families that settled there, and then what the Portuguese Historical and Culture Society did, I really found that fascinating, interesting, and did my master's thesis on the history and development of the Greenhaven Pocket area. And from there, I became involved in the Portuguese community in Sacramento. I got involved in Portuguese Historical and Culture Society. I began to meet people and know people in the community. I actually went to when I started doing my research, I went to my first festa. It was in the Freeport area, actually, just south of the Pocket area. So I started to become more understanding the Portuguese culture and heritage as well, and kind of having some mentors in the community help me. Because at that time, my grandmother, so she was the only one living when I was young and growing up. She passed in 1998. She kind of knew I started to do research on the Sacramento's pocket area, but then she passed. So I never really had anybody in my family I knew of offhand that could teach me about Portuguese culture and heritage. So I kind of found it from other people in the community when I was doing research.
And so this research for your master's is basically the impetus that took you into the Portuguese community.
Correct. So from there, after I got my master's degree, I went on to the PhD program at UC Davis in geography, and my professors knew of my interest in the Portuguese community and kind of fostered that and wanted me to continue on. And so I learned a lot about other Portuguese communities in California, and the fact that there's so many communities in California, number one, that they settled throughout the state. And I was just very intrigued by just looking to see what other communities had in terms of landscape features, like the pocket area had that commemorated Portuguese history and culture. I became very fascinated with Portuguese halls. That's still something that intrigues me to this day, to learn about Portuguese halls and all the halls in California. My professors one in particular had encouraged me to go to the Azores as part of my research for my dissertation, and also to learn Portuguese language, which I wasn't familiar with. So in the year 2000, I went to CSU Stanislaus, to the Portuguese Summer Institute, to take some Portuguese language courses there. That's how I met you. And then in 2001, in the summer 2001, I went to the University of the Azores, to the Curso de Verão, the summer program there through Rosa Simas, and was able to go to the Azores for the first time and study Portuguese there as well, and then learn more about the Azores also.
Let me ask you about that experience to the Azores. So that was your first time going to the Azores, or already as a grad student going involved in a PhD program. How was, so you went there obviously for academic reasons, but there was obviously a family reason and a reason, of heritage and affection. And so how was that experience for you beyond the academics? How did the experience sit with you this first visits to the Azores, and have you been back since?
So I have not been back to the Azores since, unfortunately. My first experience, that was kind of my first experience actually overseas in general. I'd never been overseas at all. So it was my first time traveling overseas. I just remember having a long flight to even get there. I was in, I'm trying to remember, I think I was in London, and then I went to Lisbon, and then I went to Ponta Delgada. So it was my first experience just being, across the Atlantic and going overseas. So that in itself was interesting, especially dealing with a language barrier and traveling on your own for the first time. And then when I got to the Azores, I connected right away with I was lucky because it was a summer course program with other students coming in from other colleges that were in the United States. So like there was people from California, there was people from the East Coast. So I connected very well with people that I met. I actually met up somebody that I was close with from Canada also. She lived in Toronto. So because it was like a summer, not exchange program, but a summer program where I was with people from the United States and from Canada. I didn't speak Portuguese that much, when I was there, because I had people that I hung out with that, spoke English. I thought the Azores were very beautiful. The landscape and the natural topography and the natural features were amazing. I was in so the program, how it was set up, was a 6-week program where you took classes at the University of the Azores. So I was in San Miguel for like 5 weeks. And then we were finally able to go, I think the last week of the program, the last week and a half of the program, we went to other islands. So, because I was tired of San Miguel after five weeks. It was getting tiring, but it was a beautiful island. So we went to Terceira for a few days. Then we went to Pico for a few days, and then we went to Fayal. So again, my background is interesting because again, my grandmother was born in Fayal, but on my grandfather's side, he was also of Azorean descent, full Portuguese. He was born in Massachusetts, but his mother was from Pico and his father was from São Miguel. And when my grandmother passed away, my aunt had given me old photos of my great grandparents. I never knew what they looked. I never knew about them. I never knew what they looked like, and I got these photos. So I knew that my great grandfather was from San Miguel, but I just never knew which village he was from, and I wasn't into genealogy at that time. So when I was in San Miguel, and we went to different villages and toured different areas, I always wondered, is my grandfather or great grandfather from this village or that village? I just never knew. And then when I went to Pico, same thing with my great grandmother. I didn't know exactly where she was from at the time. So when I got to Fayal, because I knew where my grandmother was born, which village, I was very excited because, I could have some sort of family connection and see the village that she was from. And unfortunately, when we got to Fayal, this is an interesting story. They have a small sector of the University of Azores there. And many students in the program, when we got to our housing quarters, people just didn't like the housing quarters and they didn't feel safe. So the people that I hung out with in the program, we decided to stay in a hotel the night we were in Fayal and then just leave early and go back to São Miguel to finish our coursework. So I wasn't in Fayal for very long. I was only in Fayal for a day. And when I went there, we were in Horta. Actually, I was there for about 2 days. We were in Horta, and I know Feiteira was only about maybe 10 or 15 miles away. And I really wanted to go to that village. That was where my grandmother was born. So I took a cab with a few friends of mine in the program, and I was able to find the church that she was baptized in. And unfortunately, at that time, so they had a major earthquake in Fayal in 1998, and this was in 2001 that I was in the village. They were still kind of recuperating, I guess, from the earthquake. So when I went to see the church, I had an old picture of the church, but it was like closed and it was kind of cracked from the earthquake. And I saw the Imperio of the church because I had like an old picture of the Imperio where she was baptized. And there was a cemetery right by there, and her maiden name was Faria. And I had seen other grave sites that said Faria, but again, I just had no connection. I didn't know if I had any distant relatives that lived there, or I just didn't know who was there. So I just saw the village briefly, and then the cab driver wanted to take us to Capelinos because Capelinos was a big thing to see when you go to Fayal. So we went there, and I saw that, and then we went back. And after that, I went back to the airport, and then left, unfortunately. So I was only in Fayal for like a day and a half, and I really wanted to stay there longer. Because that was the island I was really connected to, knowing that my grandmother was born there, and I had more information, at least a little more information than my others, the Pico and the San Miguel side. So anyway, so now 20 years later, 20 years later, being in the Azores, I want to go back because I have a lot more information now, and I know relatives that live in Fayal that I'm connected with on Facebook that live there, and I want to go back to finally meet family and see my connections. So,
was there any special, although it was just momentarily for a few minutes or a very very short amount of time, was there any special feelings that you kind of felt, being yet not being able to see all that you wanted to see, but being in the village where your grandmother had left at the 1.5, and your great grandparents, and the church, like you said, where she was baptized? How were there any special feelings that came to you at that time, even though as young as you were?
There were special feelings. I think I was in my early 20s at the time, so there was a lot of special feelings I had. I just felt so rushed to kind of get out of the island. I just felt like I was rushed and I was ready. It's like somebody wanted me to like leave the island quickly. I just felt very rushed. I was in San Miguel for so long, because that was part of the coursework, and I was tired of San Miguel. I wanted to see the other islands, but then when I was in Fayal, I wanted to be there longer, but I just felt like I was rushed to kind of get out of there for some reason. I don't know. It was a weird feeling. Because again, I don't know exactly why it's interesting with my grandmother's parents and my great grandfather and their story. Again, when they left the Azores, that was a time, when there was great poverty, overcrowding. I'm sure they heard about the stories of America, being that, they had, my great grandfather had family in the United States. So that's why they left. But it's interesting. And there was a few siblings of my great grandfather that actually stayed in the Azores. And I found family now that are connected to that part of it, in Massachusetts, who are more connected to the culture, because their ancestors stayed in the Azores, and then their grandfather and then their father stayed in the Azores, and then so this cousin I have, a third cousin, all her siblings were born in Faytera. She was the only one born in the United States, but she grew up in the Portuguese culture in the community in Massachusetts. So she's very, she still speaks the language. She's still very part of the community. She's actually a radio DJ. She plays Portuguese music. So it's just weird. We're both of the same generation, like same age and stuff. But just because her great grandfather stayed in the Azores and mine left, we have different trajectories in a way towards the Portuguese community. So I just find that interesting. So. Yeah.
That is very interesting, yes, because the trajectories were different, and one stayed longer, and the other one, of course, came and Americanized.
Yes.
And so let's talk a little bit about your Portuguese connections after that, which was, of course, through your academic work and your PhD in geography through UC Davis. I know that we're not going to talk about the entire thesis because that takes a few hours to read, but or dissertation, what did you try to accomplish with the dissertation, and what surprises did you find along the way?
So my dissertation work was on the Portuguese cultural landscape in California, and my main goal with the dissertation was to really create an inventory of Portuguese communities in California and the landscape features that are a result of where the Portuguese have settled. So my dissertation is in geography, culture geography. So I really looked at where the Portuguese had settled in California and the Portuguese population patterns, especially to update that information from the 80s to the 2000s. Again, in my field in geography, there have been a few works on the Portuguese in California, but again, a lot of that was outdated. So my goal was to update at least the locational information of the Portuguese in California and their population estimates, and then to create this inventory of Portuguese cultural landscape features. So I listed and inventoried all the Portuguese halls in California, whether that be the Holy Ghost halls, the band halls, the social halls, etc. I inventoried Portuguese street names in California, Portuguese bull rings, any Portuguese parks of Portuguese theme. So I talked about Portuguese Community Park earlier in the POC area in Sacramento. There's also a few other parks of Portuguese theme in California, including the one in Hayward and Portuguese Centennial Park, and also Root Park in San Leandro. I had also inventoried or discussed Portuguese commercial districts in California, particularly a Little Portugal district in San Jose, inventorying the Portuguese businesses there. At the time when I was doing my dissertation work, I was an intern at the California Main Street program that worked on downtown revitalization. And there were some other commercial districts in California, particularly in Hanford, where they were becoming Main Street programs and wanting to do more revitalization efforts in their downtown. And I remember going to Hanford, and they had a Portuguese theme night when they became a certified Main Street community. So I was looking kind of at revitalization efforts and the use of commercial districts promoting ethnic heritage, like Portuguese is part of that. So So yeah, so my dissertation was really to inventory a lot of the cultural landscape features in Portuguese communities. And I also talked about some things you see when you go to Portuguese halls, what are common features you see at Portuguese halls, or you go into certain neighborhoods in the Portuguese community, what certain features you see that are distinctly Portuguese. Like in particular, I've seen this in Hilmar, and when I went to Artesia, where they had strong Portuguese communities near the Portuguese halls, I would see houses that would have little tiles of depicting a saint or religious figure. And I saw that in the Azores too. Or I would see saints in people's yards, or I would see Portuguese flags. Just a way of how people are identifying their Portuguese heritage through the landscape. And then also as part of my dissertation research, and my professors really wanted me to focus this as well, looking at the ethnographic side, where I talk to Portuguese people and interview them about how they feel about their Portuguese heritage and being Portuguese, and how they connect to the community and to the landscape features in general. So I interviewed Portuguese people of various ages and generations. I handed out questionnaires to Portuguese people as well, just to get an understanding for their love of the culture and the heritage, how they see the community going forward, and particularly preserving Portuguese cultural landscapes. And then one last final thought related to my dissertation. I've being a government employee and working in the development community, I very much know about historic preservation efforts and things to get on the National Register of Historic Places or on state registers. And that's very limited, unfortunately, in the Portuguese community. There's not many places that are recognized as historical landmarks by our government agencies. So I had a discussion on that in the conclusion of my dissertation, and that might be something that would be important to look into in the future for Portuguese communities in California.
Indeed, that would. And so all this work, of course, from your early master's thesis to then your PhD dissertation, learning Portuguese, doing summer courses here and in the Azores, how do you think all of this shaped who you are, both professionally and personally?
Oh, it definitely very much shaped me professionally and personally. I feel, when people see me and know me, they know that I've done my research on the Portuguese community. They know I'm half Portuguese. I mean, I think I've established my identity now by doing all this work. I established my identity in the community, and I've established a personal identity for myself too. And it became a part of my focus in my career too, and kind of was my trajectory towards my career also, and kind of set up, where I'm at today too. So it's very much shaped my identity and who I am. And I guess maybe when I was a child, I was always craving it. And I found it through education and through just doing the hard work and doing the research and just getting out there and being a part of the community now. So I feel I've established myself because of that. So
what does it mean to you to be Portuguese American, that you've done your research and you have this information that you didn't have, of course, as a child and in your teenage years, but that you've had since, your academic years, since your 20s. So, 20 years later, what does it mean to you to be Portuguese American?
I'm very proud to be Portuguese American. It's kind of difficult at times, though, because again, I'm technically fourth generation. So I feel like I'm more of an American of Portuguese descent, because I'll always love America and be American growing up in America. And I think I might have told you this before, when I went to the Azores and when I went to Terceira, and we went to the US Air Force Base. Being at that base, it was where I really, it was weird. I felt like I was at home, I was familiar with it, the food was all familiar to me and everything. And then another thing too, related to my trip to the Azores, it was the first time that I spent 4th of July outside of the United States, and they didn't celebrate 4th of July in the Azores. So that kind of was, I was kind of yearning for celebrating 4th of July, but they didn't celebrate it there. So that I kind of missed that too. So I'm proud of being Portuguese, and I'm very proud of the fact that there's so many Portuguese communities in California, and that we've continued our traditions, and that I have places to take my son and places to go to where we can, be Portuguese and celebrate the Portuguese culture. And I have those connections. So I'm all very proud of that. And that's part of my identity. But then there's always me also that's the American. I'm an American, and I still speak English. I don't speak Portuguese hardly at all, and I feel bad about that too. And so that there's always still that dichotomy. But I'm definitely proud of my heritage and being Portuguese American. So.
And how do you see the Portuguese American community here in California today? And I preface that by saying that when you started all of your research and when you started getting involved, like you said, 22, 23 years ago now, and even before a little bit, you already, going into it a little bit, the community has changed, and partly because at that time in 2000, there were still immigrants that had been here recently. They had arrived in the 1970s and early 1980s. Today, those same immigrants that had been here for, at that time, maybe, 18 to 20 years, now they've been here, 40 and 50 years. And now it's basically their sons and their daughters who are the adults in the community. So they're catching up with you. They're already second and third generation. So how do you see that? And I know you're involved in Portuguese American organizations. So how do you see this metamorphosis, let's say, in the community as it becomes exactly what you said earlier, as it becomes more American and less Portuguese? Doesn't mean that you don't identify with it, but it means sometimes that you may not do the things that your grandparents or great-grandparents did on a daily basis. So what are your thoughts on that from your experiences academically and from your experiences with Portuguese American organizations?
Well, I definitely know the Portuguese community's changing, especially in the past 20 years when I started doing my research. It's obviously getting older in population, in aging, and there's always the problem of trying to get younger people more involved in the community. Was interesting to maybe understand and understand as well. So I'm not very connected with many of the first generation Portuguese that came, from the Azores, immigrated to the United States in the 50s and 60s, because I know that really helped, make the Portuguese communities thrive again in California and brought the language and more of the culture, really, energized the community. Because again, my grandparents' generation, was settled really early on. They were Americanized, I think, by the 50s. Like my grandmother and my grandfather, they were Americanized, and so I know that generation, the 50s and 60s, really made it thrive. And now obviously immigration is declining. I do see it aging, and I do see that there's a problem of having more younger people be involved, and the lack of immigration. I think it's very important to keep the language alive. Even though I don't speak Portuguese very much, I feel bad about that. It's very important to keep the language going. And I know you've talked about that, about having more, language courses in the community, having more language classes in the universities and so forth. And that's a struggle that we need to keep continuing to do, because obviously the language is very important. And then, keeping the traditions and the festas going is very important as well. Again, I know the population is aging, and then the generations are getting older. This would be also interesting to know. Again, I'm half Portuguese. Do many full Portuguese people, are they marrying into the Portuguese culture still, or are they? That's another aspect too as well. That because my son's only a quarter Portuguese, so we're also becoming, because Portuguese aren't marrying Portuguese. There's less of that too as well. There's less full Portuguese people, and that could be an issue also that might need to be looked at too. So.
Good academic study indeed. So as we come to the end, is there anything that we didn't cover in this oral history interview? Carol, thank you so much. But is there anything that we didn't cover that you'd like to share personally or professionally within your involvement and your identity?
Again, just being proud of my Portuguese heritage and culture, and the fact that in California, there are so many Portuguese communities throughout the state, and the fact that so many Portuguese communities throughout the state, and this aspect needs to be studied more and looked at. I was going to show you that there was a study on the cultural landscape in Massachusetts and how, that Portuguese community has grown and thrived. And it is so much different from California. And it would be good to have a study done on the Portuguese communities in California and the landscape. So again, there's a lot of work still to be done. So I'm glad to be part of this interview. Thank you.